I want to thank you, Leah, first of all, for doing this talk for us. We really appreciate it. Schuylkill Indivisible wanted to do something for Earth Day, but under the circumstances, we were going to have it at the library along with some art projects, but we had to modify it, and Leah was very good at modifying it with me. She did all the work. But so, yeah, and you can get started, Leah. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is going to be pretty informal. I have some slides to share, and we'll talk about the best plants and like, why would you want to even have these plants? Many of them have the name weed in them. They're beautiful, but just kind of the way they've been named in history has scared a lot of people off from planting them in their yard. I consider myself a beginner in all of this. There's people on this call. There are biologists. There's Randy, who is like head of the native plant garden at Hawk Mountain. Herbal Keir's on here. So there's very smart people who know a lot more than me. So I would love at the end for them to be able to share, and kind of follow up on anything that I may have missed. But we'll just get started here. So I'm going to pop up my screen. And let me just kind of minimize. I'm going to have to minimize this stuff here. Good. So everybody should be able to see my screen. Can you see that okay?
It looks good, Leah.
Okay, we'll get going then. All right, so yeah, we decided, Rachel and I, thank you Indivisible for having us and for having a presence in Schuylkill County. We've been talking a long time about doing some sort of a native plant project. So I feel like this might be the beginning of that. And then hopefully next year, things will be a little calmer and, maybe we could put in a community plot somewhere in Schuylkill County as a butterfly garden. So my name's Leah Zerby. I know a lot of you all. If I don't, maybe we could catch up after this call. But I live on Potter's Farm in Pine Grove. Potter was the nickname of my grandfather. I never got to meet him, but it's really cool to be living here again. And sorry, to be able to work the land that he worked, even though I didn't know him. So pretty cool stuff. I'll just give you a little bit of what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about the top 10 native plants for your garden, but we'll talk about way more than 10 because there are so many to choose from. We'll even talk about some plant species that might do better in wet areas of your yard. I know here on the farm, we're almost kind of having a wetland situation the last few years. It just is consistently very wet there. So there's some great plants that we started incorporating down there, and they're really starting to take off this year, which is cool. So even if you have a swampy area of your yard, that's fine. You just have to find the right plants to grow there. We'll touch briefly on how to make a monarch way station, which is basically a butterfly garden that has specific plants in it that bloom at specific times of the year to support the monarch population and population of all pollinators. As we know, they're in a huge decline. So it's a great way to take a chunk of your yard, or all of your yard, and do something that will have many wonderful ripple effects that we'll talk about way beyond pollinator support. And then we'll talk a little bit about establishing a meadow. So some folks on this call may want to have more of a structured traditional garden, and that's totally fine. You can use all of the plants we'll talk about in that sense. Some people are dipping their toe into making a meadow. It's a little wilder, and to be completely honest, it's a lot less work. A little more work up front, but then you just kind of let it do its thing and just do some routine maintenance. So we'll talk about meadows too. We'll talk about where to find these plants. Natives are becoming more popular, native plant species, but it still can be a little bit hard to find them around here in Schuylkill County. So we'll talk about where to find them and how to get them. And we'll also talk about why we need bugs in our yard, which is very important. And we've many of us grown up to think, bugs are bad and they're gonna kill our trees, and some of them do. But most of the ones that cause big trouble here have been introduced. So we do need the right kind of bugs in our yards. I just wanted to spend a minute to give a quick history of this farm. It's a 6th-generation family farm. So grateful to my parents that they never sold it or, developed it or any of that kind of stuff. When I was little, it was always leased out because when Potter, my grandfather, died, my dad was just 12. So my grandmother had leased it out to folks to just keep the farm alive. So they kept it in ag. But over the years, what was a pretty natural farm became more and more chemical based. And that was just kind of the times. We were told the chemicals would kill the bugs and they would kill the weeds, and they did. But, we also know now that there's a lot of bad side effects of that. So when my husband and I moved home about 11 years ago now, I was working at Rodale learning all about, as an environmental health reporter, learning about not just how the chemicals are damaging the soil, but how they're also damaging our bodies. So we had no idea what we were doing farming, but we made it our mission to make the farm completely organic. So we started that transition the first spring we moved home. Thankfully, the farmer who was leasing most of our land at the time agreed, and it is now certified organic hay farm. Greg and I started growing vegetables, and we started a community-supported agriculture program where people would come and get a box full of veggies every week during the growing season. And we did that for about 5 or 6 years. But because we both have other full-time jobs and farming is a very intense and full-time job in and of itself, we kind of shied away from that. We just grow a little bit of vegetables now. But what I was so drawn to the whole time out, in the vegetable field, I'm like looking over at the meadow that I had started, and that's where I wanted to be. So much life is in a meadow. Even just a year or two after starting one, you'll start just seeing all of the life come back and the balance and the biodiversity. So because that is kind of my true love, more so than growing food, we kind of farm for pollinators now. And when I talk to USDA and they ask me what I grow, I just say I grow native wildflower meadows. I farm for pollinators, and they're kind of getting it, kind of still have some work to go there. So by us doing that, we're not directly producing food, but we're creating a more robust, biodiverse situation for our pollinators, so all the farms in our area can benefit. Because as we'll get into later, the food web really starts with the bugs. So we have to have the bugs and the beneficials and the pollinators. And we're really seeing a comeback in nature here. So last year we noticed that we have eastern meadowlarks, a lot of them actually. Dan Mamart from, I think he's with the Game Commission. He came out, he's a biodiversity scientist. And he was like totally thrilled at the level, like, of all of the eastern meadowlarks that he was seeing everywhere, because apparently they're in major decline because we have so many fields that are cut, and we have so many yards, and meadowlarks need meadows to live. So it's really cool in just a few years to see all of these species who have been on the decline coming back here. And just wanted to take a second to talk about my mentors. So my sister Faith is on the call. She is the coolest person I know. My number one mentor. And so this is her yard. She lives outside of West Philly. She's a very small yard, but as you can see, the whole thing is in native plants. And this is her this spring. She's just kind of, doing some divisions and putting plants out for free, which is another really fun thing when you start growing natives. Every few years you have to start dividing them, and then you can start giving them away to your neighbors. And the native wildflower effect starts rippling and rippling. Kids are always in her yard looking at the bugs, learning about the plants, seeing the butterflies and the caterpillars. So it's really become like a cool yard for the kids to hang out and check out. And this can be your yard too. And my sister's also a biologist. She works for Delaware Riverkeeper. And the Delaware River was just named American River's River of the Year. So if we have more kind of science-based questions at the end, she'll be happy to answer. Another part of kind of me getting into this field and just kind of paying respect to mentors is, as I moved home from the farm, I was working for Rodale Publishing. And they're kind of, they have the Rodale Institute, which is basically the home of organic, the whole organic farming and growing movement in America. So at a time where I was starting to learn more about pollinators and writing about human health and the connection between environmental health and what's going on in our yards and what's going on in our bodies, it all just was really coming together at the right time. I was writing for Organic Gardening and Prevention Magazine and Men's Health, and being able to talk about the food system and the connection between our environment and our health was really an honor. And I continue to do that today, but for different publications. And then another mentor, and somebody we're going to talk about a lot today, is Doug Tallamy. So science is great, and we all know that, you know, it's so important more than ever these days. But Doug, you know, I get to interview him a lot. He'll say, you know, we tend to be in our little buckets with science. We have such highly specialized areas that, you know, as he was growing up and going to school to be an entomologist, he was thinking about bugs, but he wasn't thinking about birds, and he wasn't thinking about the food system because that wasn't in his, you know, his narrow scope. There's so much to learn just to become an entomologist. So it wasn't until later in life where he told me he started just kind of backing away and seeing the whole big picture. I mean, he's really been a pioneering force behind the native plant movement and growing plants that are meant to be grown in our geographic location that have been here, you know, for millions of years, and the bugs that have adapted to live with them, and then the whole food system that has kind of grown around that. So he has a new book out, actually. It's called, there it is. It's called Nature's Best Hope. And we'll talk about this later, but he's actually going to do a call with any of us that wants to on May 2nd. So that's something to put on your list, and a really good book you might want to add onto your Kindle. He also wrote Bringing Nature Home, which really kind of sparked the whole native plant gardening movement in America. So here's kind of the problem, the solution, the goals, and how we can all kind of work together to do this. So Tallamy basically says we have pretty much destroyed our natural habitat. I think something like east of the Mississippi, 85% of land is privately owned. So it's pretty much on us to bring back biodiversity and to bring back balance in nature. And the cool thing is, no matter how big your yard is, or even if you don't have a yard, if you have a park where you can influence people there, we can each take individual steps to make a gigantic difference. But we have to really kind of shift our way of thinking and the paradigm about gardening. So really, to do that, we have to plant to support pollinators. And we have to also know that as we're doing this, and as we're kind of taking away layers of our turf lawn and adding these more beneficial plants, that we're also doing a much even bigger service, and that's storing carbon. So a turf yard doesn't store very much carbon. The roots aren't deep. It almost, you know, it causes a lot of runoff, which contributes to flooding, which if you live in Schuylkill County, you know, that's a huge problem. And it helps, you know, by taking back the lawn and adding more of these plants that are meant to be here in Pennsylvania and Schuylkill County, you'll help reduce flooding. You'll help mitigate climate change. You'll store carbon in the ground, keeping it out of the atmosphere, and you'll also help the food system. So, I mean, I don't know what could be a greater inspiration to start working some of these plants into the garden. So this is the book, Bringing Nature Home, and you may want to put this one on your reading list too. So this was his first book. The new one, again, is called Nature's Best Hope. They're both great. And what I love about Doug Tallamy is he just kind of says it how it is. He's quite feisty. And he's also really good about talking about history and how some of the greatest conservation movements that occurred in America came out of the Conservative Party. They came out of the GOP. And then there was a really big shift. And what Tallamy will say is he thinks, you know, it was fueled largely by corporate interest and conservative talk radio, where we really pulled away from the Conservative Party having conservation values. So what's cool about gardening is it's one of those uniting issues in a time where we're all kind of fighting, and I'm yelling at people on Facebook about wearing masks, and everybody's really kind of tightly wound right now. Gardening is a really cool entry point where we can all kind of talk together and work together and kind of connect on this level. So again, here are some of the benefits of going native, and in a second we'll get into more about, well, what does that mean, go native? Native plants are plants that are meant to be growing here. They've evolved to be growing here in this location. All of the bugs in the ecosystem here are meant to specialize on a specific plant. So you probably all know that monarch butterflies need milkweed. Of course, they can go around and get nectar from all sorts of plants, But in order for them to rear young, and for more generations of monarchs to survive, they have to have milkweed. They're specialized. And most of the insects in our population are specialized. So we need plants that have evolved to be here. Another great thing about growing native plants is they're so low maintenance, most of them. It's fantastic. You don't have to be worrying about chemical fertilizers or, setting up a water sprinkling system. They're very low maintenance because they're meant to be here. And here's a really cool quote from Doug Tallamy that I just wanted to share because I just thought it really brought the whole idea home. He said, gardening is like cooking. It is tempting to cook only with the goal of achieving great taste with no thought of healthy eating, but that often results in tasty concoctions so full of fat, sugar, and salt that they are deadly in the long run. And he kind of equates the same thing to what we've been growing in our gardens and our yards over the last 100 years or so. We plant things that are exotic, that are different. As humans, we tend to be collectors, and we like to have something different from the person in our next yard. And that has just created this whole major industry of importing exotic plants from other countries. And they are beautiful. And they do provide nectar, and, the trees provide shade. But they're pretty defunct when it comes to supporting the food system. They are not feeding or helping the native bugs that need to live here, that are the basis of the food chain to survive. And we can see another place where people can really connect is birds. And we know, every study you look at, our bird population is really crashing too. And people love their backyard birds. And, so many people can tell you the populations just aren't what they were a few decades ago. And that's because there aren't the caterpillars that they need to rear their young around. So the great thing is we can plant what they need, and you'll start seeing the birds come back in your yard. So here's some really interesting information about how we waste so much money on our yards. Turf lawns are the #1 crop in America. They cover about 20 million acres the last time I checked, more than ag land. And there was a really cool study. I found it on the EPA's website. I'm not exactly sure if they did this study or if they were just kind of reporting on it. But they looked over a 20-year period. And when they looked at a plot of land that was in native wildflower meadow or prairie, just more natural and native plants, versus a turf lawn situation, it comes out that if you have a turf lawn, it costs you maybe 20 grand per acre over a 20-year period versus $3,000 an acre over a 20-year period. So not only, are we helping the food system and storing carbon, even if you don't care about any of that, you can save major money starting to kind of replace part of your turf lawn with some of the plants that we'll talk about in a bit. And it's also just a quality of life issue. Have you ever been out on a beautiful day and your neighbor is leaf blowing or mowing the lawn? It's just it's also noise pollution, which is a real thing. 40 million lawnmowers consume 200 million gallons of gas every year. So that's a lot of air pollution in your neighborhood too. And we all know having clean air right now is more important than ever, as we are seeing areas with higher rates of air pollution are having worse outcomes with the COVID-19 infection. So air quality matters there. And gas-powered garden tools emit 5% of the nation's air pollution. That was crazy when I read that. It's a huge number. And lawnmowers tend to create about 11 times more air pollution than a new car. So finally, what is a native plant? We've been talking about them for minutes. So most of you probably know this, but it's a plant that occurred within the state here where we are in Pennsylvania before being settled by Europeans. So these are plants that were naturally occurring in Penn's woods. They've been here for a very long time, but they've been outcompeted by many of the exotic plants that we've been bringing in from other countries. And a lot of those plants, that have been sold in nursery catalogs over the decades have wound up becoming seriously invasive and creating a huge problem for our forests and our meadows and other areas, really kind of hurting biodiversity. All right, so let's talk about some of the native plants that are pretty common and are really great choices if you're just getting started. So most of the first 10 that we're going to talk about, they're usually very low maintenance. They tend to be for just full sun or a lot of sun. and not super wet situations. So just kind of like your standard yard that isn't in a very soggy spot and that gets a decent amount of sun. And Doug Talamy and I did talk about the fact that so many of these beautiful native plants have the word weed in them, which is very unfortunate because it scares a lot of people away. But this is a popular one, Joe Pye weed, and you may even notice this blooming on the side of the road as you're driving in the summertime. These get pretty tall, but they're beautiful, and every time I see Joe Pye weed, I just see a ton of butterflies all over them. So it's a really important nectar plant, usually blooming, I think, like maybe end of July-ish, depending on how things are going. And then there's what we call bee balm. So the one on the left is Monarda oh man, here we go. I'm really bad at this part. Didima. And that's the red one. And that does a little bit better in a little bit of a wetter soil. So not soil that's totally, bogged down and wet, but it tolerates and enjoys a little more moisture in the soil versus the other one, which is also known as wild bergamot. That one, and these are in the mint family, so these will really kind of take off, especially the wild bergamot. So if you have an area where you just want to kind of like let it go and have tons of bees and butterflies, these are really good choices. And then Heliopsis helianthoides, I can say that one. This is a really important one too, and it's a host plant for the silvery checker spot. So we were talking earlier about certain moths and butterflies and other insects need a specific type of plant to rear their young. So this is one of those plants where a silver checker spot butterfly needs to have this type of plant in order to rear its young. These also tend to spread and get very tall. So these can be nice kind of, if you're planning a more organized garden, these would do a little bit better in the back because they get pretty tall and they spread out. And then most people know about echinacea. It's also a wonderful healing plant and great for the immune system and the flu. So the eastern purple cone flower is the one that we plant here in Pennsylvania. And these can spread too pretty well. So it's, the opportunity to divide them after a few years and share with your family and friends and then help them get their native plant gardens going. And then most people also know about black-eyed Susans. These also get pretty tall. So these might be more for the back of a garden or maybe in the mid-range, and they kind of clump and cluster. And we also have hairy beard tongue, which is a beautiful one. And this is a host plant for the Baltimore checker spot, another beautiful butterfly. And then there are also lots of native asters to choose from. The painted lady needs asters as a host plant to reproduce. And I believe this butterfly has also been in the decline. I have not seen a lot of these on my farm growing up, but last year I started seeing a lot more of these. And this is kind of more of like a bush. It gets almost like a bushy effect to it after a few years. It's called blue false indigo. And these things are awesome. When I lived outside of West Philly in Drexel Hill, inspired by my sister, tore out my whole front yard and just had it pretty wild. And I had one of these right in the front. And when I moved home from the farm, I wanted to bring it with me because I was just afraid the next people, weren't going to be game to have a meadow on their front yard. So I tasked my husband with digging it out, and the taproot, and it was only a few years old, the taproot was like that deep. So that's a great indicator that this is a plant who isn't going to be super fussy. It has a really long taproot. So even in years where it's maybe years of drought or when it's much drier, once it's established, this is going to be a great no-fuss plant because it'll store water and what it needs in that really long taproot. And we also know those long taproots are helping to store carbon, which also helps mitigate climate change. And it's also a host plant for the wild indigo skipper, which maybe isn't the most colorful or beautiful pollinator, but it's certainly an important one nonetheless. And then we have goldenrod. So there's a few species of goldenrod that are native here, and there's a huge misconception that goldenrod causes allergies because it kind of blooms at the same time as ragweed and is yellow, but that's a complete myth. So every time you talk to anybody about natives, try to bust that myth. This is a wonderful bloomer that blooms later in the season. So it's very important for monarchs because they need to have some source of nectar as that last generation starts making their migration south. And that's another thing that's important when you're planning a pollinator garden, and we'll talk about this a little later when we talk about maybe applying for and planning an official monarch way station. You want to have native plants, but you want to kind of plan it in a way that you have early bloomers, mid bloomers, and late bloomers, so the nectar source is kind of continuous throughout the season for the pollinators. And then, of course, milkweed. So this one is becoming very popular because people have such a strong attachment to the monarch butterfly, and because they have such an incredible story with their migration. And the 3 types that we recommend here in Pennsylvania is swamp milkweed, common milkweed, and butterfly weed. So the orange one is the butterfly weed, and that tends to be a little more contained. In my experience, my butterfly weed kind of behaves more, I guess, as you would think a traditional garden plant would. It spreads a bit. It's much lower, so this would be a nice one for in the front of a garden if you're doing a more organized garden. And it's beautiful. And the monarch butterfly larvae need these milkweed leaves. They need to eat those to continue their life cycle. The one in the middle is common milkweed, and this one you'll see alongside of roads and in farm fields that aren't sprayed. And then the one on the left is swamp milkweed. So as we were talking earlier, if you have an area of your yard that's becoming very wetter than usual, this would be a good milkweed for your wetter spots. Although it can't really be in a complete bog. I did try that and mine didn't survive. So maybe kind of like at the edge of a wet spot would be good for them. And then I don't have pictures of all of these, but I just wanted to share this, and I have everybody's email, so I'll be sure to email all of these charts out to you so you have them as a handy chart. These are great charts from DCNR, and they'll show best choices for moist, sunny soils. So the ones that we were kind of talking about earlier, some of them do okay in moist, but they're more like upland plants. But as you can see, some of them will do well in drier soils or also moist soils. Cardinal flower is a beautiful one if you have maybe a rain garden, maybe somewhere near where your gutter lets the water kind of come off of the roof. They kind of do well in those types of situations. And also beard tongue can tolerate some of that wetter soil as long as it's getting sunny exposures. And then here are some choices for moist, shady soils. So I do not have a lot of shade at the farm, so I don't have as much experience in growing shady plants, but I think Faith at the end will be able to talk a little bit more about the woodland plants. But as you can see, cardinal flower here can also do okay in the shadier area too. So there's, some of them are a little more versatile than others. Jacob's ladder is a really popular one, and foam flowers are beautiful. I do have some foam flowers in front of my house in a more structured garden that my grandma had planted a long time ago, and I kind of put foam flowers in front there. It gets half shade, half sun, and they're doing really well there and spreading. And they stay pretty low, so they're only maybe 6 to 10 inches. And then we have the where did I see that? The blue lobelia. I saw that on this list somewhere. That is a good one for under pine walnut trees because they have a chemical that kills a lot of plants. So the great blue lobelia is very similar looking to a cardinal flower, but the cardinal flower is red and this is blue, and this one can live under walnut trees, which we all know it can be hard to grow things near walnut trees. And then here are some selections for shady dry spots. And again, I'm going to send all of these out to you so you have all of these lists handy. And this one includes some trees and shrubs too. I know May apples are pretty easy to identify in forests, so that's also a common forest plant, but it's something that you can grow in your yard too if you have the right conditions, which is a drier, shadier spot. And then just a word here about creating a monarch way station. It's always fun when you do the work to create an official monarch way station. All you have to do is apply, basically promise that you're going to plant, plant certain plant species and meet some certain kind of guidelines. And then you can apply and purchase a sign if you'd like. It's so cool to purchase a sign because once you have that up in your front yard, your yard just isn't a garden anymore. It also becomes an educational tool, and you'll just, kind of start planting the seed in some people's minds. And then what's really awesome is so many people visit the farm for educational things, and many people, since they've been here and see the meadows and even the more organized gardens, have gone on to create monarch way stations themselves. Really cool is the Pine Grove Achieve program had pitched the idea to do a monarch way station to get rid of some of the turf in front of the Pine Grove Middle School. And they completely planned the whole entire thing, and they pitched their superintendent, and they got approval to do this. So this is something we were supposed to do this spring, but we'll probably hold off until the fall or later if we need to. But the great thing about natives to know too is if you're not quite ready right now to plant this spring, it's great to plant natives in the fall. In fact, it may even be a little bit of a better time because there's less competition, and it just gives them time to kind of get settled in before the kind of heat of summer sets in. So spring or fall plantings are good for native plants. And I'll share this too, but these are just some of the basic guidelines for having a monarch way station. When people see ours here on the farm, it's several acres, it's gigantic, and it's a meadow. So a lot of people think, oh, I don't have enough space to have a monarch way station. But really, you just need about 100 square feet. So they certify places of all sizes. The idea is that we want to turn our yards into these little mini national parks. So just think of the impact if everybody who did 100 square feet in their yards, it would be a really cool ripple effect. And then again, we want to make sure that the space for a monarch way station has lots of sun, because most of the plants that need to be there need a lot of full sun. So those 10 plants that we went through with the photos, which I'll share with you later, and they also need to have pretty good drainage. And the plants shouldn't be super spread apart and be like heavily mulched with like 3 feet in between them, because in nature things grow much more closely and they're kind of intertwined, and that helps create shelter that the pollinators need at various stages of their life to survive. And then of course they have to contain milkweed plants so the monarchs can reproduce, but then other pollinator plants that we have talked about earlier here. And then the main thing is you cannot apply chemicals to your monarch way station ever, because that's detrimental to the insects. You can, though, you do some general maintenance and pruning or removing dead stalks if you want to. We tend to leave all of ours standing because those stalks can become important places for insects to use during the winter. All right, just kind of moving along. And then how to create a meadow. So I have done all of my meadow making through the instruction of Ernst Seeds. They're an amazing Pennsylvania seed company. Not every seed mix that they offer is native, but they do have native options, and they'll even customize if you want to. They've customized for me. They kind of say that fall is a little bit of a better time to create a meadow, but you can definitely do that in the spring too. You just might have more competition with other weeds. So when we do them on the farm, we tend to make meadows in the fall. The first thing you want to do is you want to remove all the invasive species from that meadow. And when I send out a follow-up email, I'll do a list of how to identify the most common invasive species in our area. Stiltgrass is a big one. If you live on a farm or near a farm, multiflora rose might be a problem, Japanese barberry. A really good source to start learning if things are introduced or invasive and just kind of knowing what's growing around you in your yard is to download the Seek app by iNaturalist on your iPhone. That helps you take pictures of things and identify them, and then you can look up more to see if they're invasive or introduced. If you are going to do a monarch way station, if you are going to do a meadow, the idea is to disc harrow plow it every 1 to 2 weeks. It's a little bit too soon right now because it's still getting pretty cold at night here in Schuylkill County, and it's just too wet right now. You never want to plow. You can do a soil test, dig a little spot with a shovel, put your hand in and squeeze it. And if the dirt is just kind of molding together and just sticking together, it's too wet. You kind of want it to just naturally crumble, because you can really damage your soil for a long time if you plow it before it's ready to be plowed. And then, instead of using glyphosate Roundup to kill the weed seeds, the idea is to do that disc harrow plowing every 1 to 2 weeks once it's time to plow, and you're going to start killing the weed seeds in the ground there. You can also, if you have a smaller spot, you can do plastic solarization, where you put plastic over the area, kind of pin it down, and that'll just, through the heat of summer, kill pretty much all the weed seeds in there, and then it'll be ready for you to prepare your bed and plant your meadow in the fall. So I'll also include information on that. And the wildflower seeds tend to be a little more expensive, but it really, a little goes a long way. And when we plant them, because we plant such big areas, we use a broadcast seeder. So I kind of wear it on my chest and then I crank it and it just broadcasts the seeds all over the place. And we do mix it with unscented, just plain non-clumping clay cat litter. That's something Ernst instructs people to do if it's a bigger area. And it just kind of helps disperse the seeds and mix them a little bit better. And then there are, certain times to mow and not mow when you're first establishing a meadow. So I'll make sure that I send you the planting guide for upland meadow sites that I have through Ernst Seeds, with kind of more in the weeds information about when to start mowing and at what height things should be, because you can really damage things if you mow when they're too low. You can really kind of hurt those new natives coming up during their first year, which is really important for them to get established. So the next question is, where do I find native seeds and native plants and native plant mixes and all of that? So Ernst Seeds, if you're going to do a native wildflower meadow, they're the only place I recommend. That's where we get all of our native plant seeds on the farm. They're wonderful to work with. They're a Pennsylvania company. We've actually teamed up with them because we have so many people asking us at Potter's Farm about like where to get the seeds and what should be in the mix. So we're actively working with Ernst Seeds right now to get, for us to buy them in bulk and then to get them packaged into smaller amounts that most people would need for their yard. Because most people, when they do a meadow, they're looking at maybe like 1/10 of an acre, usually, something like that. So that's something we can help you out with. If you have a much bigger area and you need to buy a big bulk order, you can just contact Ernst directly. Hawk Mountain usually has a native plant sale in the spring and the fall. And at the end of the call, I'll let Randy update us because I am not sure what's the current status is of the native plant sale there. If you live down in the Philadelphia, Delaware County area, Redbud Native Plant Nursery is great. They're under a new ownership and they're open and they're working with people through this whole COVID-19 crisis, doing online or phone orders and then curbside pickup. So you can actually get your plants through them without having any contact in the store. And if you live in the Lehigh Valley area, Edge of the Woods is another really great native plant nursery there. We at Potter's Farm are also working with a native plant wholesaler in New Jersey, and we're working on getting small plugs. So these aren't the big, potted plants with all of the soil that you get when you go to a native plant sale or when you go to a nursery. These are small landscaping plugs, but they have very established roots. They're much cheaper. For some folks, they're not used to planting with this type of thing because the plants are really small. But we know native plants are just like ready to go. They're ready to take off. So if anyone is interested in using those landscaping plugs, they're much cheaper. The plants are much smaller, but the roots are well established and they'll take off. So that's another thing we'll be offering. I'm working on getting all of that information out. And then the second thing I kind of mentioned earlier that you all may be interested in is, and this would be just a huge treat, is to sign up to do a Zoom call with Doug Tallamy. Again, he's the author of Nature's Best Hope. He's a professor at the University of Delaware, professor of entomology, and one of the real pioneers in helping us figure out that what we do in our yard and what we plant in our yard is literally determining human survival, really. I mean, and he'll tell you, it sounds a bit extreme, like, oh, if I'm planting hostas, am I really, hurting humanity? Well, he'll tell you that you are, because with every choice that you make in your yard, you can support the food system and you can support the whole food web, which we need to survive. I mean, we're way up top on the food web. We need the rungs underneath us to be doing well. And right now we know that they're not. All right, so now here's the hard part. I'm gonna have to figure out how we can take questions here. Okay. So I think I like allowed people to talk. So you may be able to unmute yourself. Faith, are you able to talk?
I now unmuted myself, so I think I could talk. Can you hear me all?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the only thing I wanted to say, Leah, great job on all of that. And I wanted to just say that, like, being downriver, right, in a smaller patch. So Leah has Potter's Farm and there's large, big areas. But I think the thing to emphasize is even if you just earmark a small area of your lawn, depending on where you are, to just stop mowing it can be a really good start, right? So you don't have to start big. I mean, Leah, who is my sister, who is always doing things very big and awesome, you know, and again, that's really good to do because you can do it. It's native plants. They're very forgiving. But the idea that even a small patch gives so much hope and so much goodness to wildlife. And my little yard here and, you know, right outside of West Philly, it's a small patch. It might be 10 foot by 25 feet maybe. But the idea is every year is a monarch way station, which Leah talked about. We have thousands of monarchs that come here in this small patch surrounded by very small footprints in Delaware County. And the monarchs come in, they know it's here, and they raise their babies here. And you shouldn't feel like it's overwhelming or you have to do a big spot. You can start small, and that small footprint can really, really make a difference, which is a lot of what Leah and Doug Talamay talk about too. But just keep it in mind. Realize that we're all very busy and there's a lot going on. So starting small is always really a great way to do it. And you don't have to, you know, rip the whole field if you don't want to.
Does anybody else have any questions? If you're having trouble unmuting, you can also, there's a little chat function.
Leah, I have a question for your sister.
Sure.
You had stated at the beginning of your talk that the Delaware River achieved an award this year for the what?
The River of the Year. American Rivers named it River of the Year, right, Faith?
Yeah, so it's kind of something that happens every year. And the last time we had gotten it, it was the Endangered River of the Year, and now we're the Protected River of the Year. And
Can you speak about the problem with the salt coming up the river from where it opens into the ocean?
yeah, so with the Delaware River, which is kind of downstream of a lot of people who might be on the call, right? Because you might be up in the Schuylkill watershed, or you might even be in the Susquehanna. But on the Delaware River, we do have issues of salt content, right? And a lot of that also comes from, to connect it back to what we're all talking about today with native plants, is the idea of is if we do less to put salt on our properties, right, with winter, we're going to do a better job. But the whole idea with the Delaware is we have the drinking water of over 17 million people, 15 million depending on who you are. And with climate change and other issues, as you come up towards Philadelphia, you have a salt line towards the Trenton line. And the idea is that we have to keep our river clean to be able to protect drinking water supplies for urban areas, which again are very much connected to rural areas. And this is why it's really important we're always working together. The idea that we have rural and urban areas connected, we all have the same problems, right? We all want fresh water. So that concept of keeping the water clean is really important, and native plants help to do that as well. So whenever we can take a little small patch of lawn, if we have lawn, if we're privileged enough to have a little space, which many people don't have, to make it a place where stormwater doesn't flow out from the lawn, because as Leah talked about, a lawn is almost as impervious as concrete. So we wouldn't want to see concrete up against a stream or in a meadow. We want to see natural things, and those natural things will take away salt and other issues and other pollutants that we are, kind of continually as human beings putting on the land.
Thank you.
Good question.
Leah,
Yes.
I do have a question. Sorry, I arrived late, but you did talk about creating the meadow, and especially for the monarch butterflies. And I love that Faith said, even if you have a small patch, just not mowing it is wonderful. Because just this morning, my husband and I were talking about not mowing all of our backyard, just leaving some space to let it turn into a meadow. But then you also mentioned, the invasive species like stilt grass, which I know we have. We haven't been treating our yard with any chemicals for a long time, so that's a positive. So if we don't mow a section of our backyard, should we be perhaps at least removing some of the grass that's there? I can try to be vigilant about the stilt grass and other invasive species that might be taking over. What is the best approach of not mowing? I could even probably turn the sod over and put, some sort of a permaculture type of dressing on it. I have plenty of cardboard and other things that I could apply to it. So not mowing is the first step. What is the next step?
Yeah, and I'll let the biologist chime in, but I think it's interesting to not mow initially just to see what is actually going to come up. My sister is helping my aunt who lives in Schuylkill County, who lives in a wetter area, and they've been very intensely mowing the lawn there. My aunt and her husband had for many decades. So my sister started allowing sections of the yard to just grow, and to her surprise, there's tons of asters coming up. I don't know where they came from. Maybe they came from our meadow half a mile down the road. I'm not sure. But just my first thing would be not mow and see what comes up. Use your CCAP and see what's actually coming up. Beyond that, Faith, your Maya, who is the Delaware River keeper, doesn't she use a lot of solarization when she wants to kill lawn?
Yeah, so we've used socialization, or not solarization, sorry, on the yard. But the idea is, yeah, depending on where you are, you might have some really great volunteers coming in, like Leah said. And the other part of that is you could start getting some beautiful native shrubs and kind of start putting these little woody shrub species in that, we have amelanchier, like we have shad bush right now that is in bloom as the shad is moving up the river. We have winter berries, which are really beautiful, and they get these wonderful berries for birds. And you could start tucking in small shrubs. And I think Leah talked about Ernst and other places that provide bare root shrubs to get them in the ground. So if you're like, okay, I have this yard, I'm going to see what grows, but then let me tuck in a couple things, let me start putting in a couple things. And then you have ones that Leah talked about, right? Monarda is really fabulous. Monarda fistulosa, which is a bee balm, which bees are going to love. Pollinators and butterflies will love it. It will.
Yeah, I have that.
With your yard, right? Like it'll start kind of, because it's immense. So recognize, and it all depends on how much space you have. But I don't have the luxury of a lot of space. If I did, I would be planting that everywhere, and I do have it in my garden. I also have things like golden Alexanders. They're in bloom now. And they're an early season part, which Leah talked about, right? The idea of, okay, what's in bloom now? So I think for natives, it's important, bees have come out, like the solitary mason bees were out at my house in Delaware County. And again, I'm kind of in this urban envelope, but they were out 2 weeks ago. And it's really important they have pollinator, like flowers to feed on, or otherwise they starve, right? With climate change, this is happening. So they have right now the shad bush, they have the golden Alexanders, and looking out in my yard, there's some violets, you know, that also come up often in
Right.
yards that they're using, and that's about it. Blueberries are also in bloom here. But putting those kinds of plants in, I think that are kind of more, you know, more aggressive are key.
That's great. I actually have some of those species growing in my yard right now, so it's wonderful. And thank you, Leah. Just a hi.
Yeah,
This
where
is
do you
Kim
live?
Jones.
Yeah,
This we've worked together in the
yeah.
past,
Are
Leah.
you still in the Philly area?
I am in Lehigh Valley,
Oh,
and
okay.
Edge of the Woods Nursery is
Yeah.
within like a couple of miles from me. So, and I've had Sue come down and all that. So, thank you. And
Yeah.
hi,
Hi, it's good to, thank you for joining.
lovely to be here.
I'm looking at the questions here. Colleen is asking, my neighbor has pine trees that border one side of my property. I have trouble growing anything there. Any suggestions? Would raised beds help? So is it, are they getting any sun, or is it mostly shade? I guess that would be the first to know the sun situation. And then the other thing would be that the soil is probably more acidic there because it's near pine trees. I would have to look up, unless anybody on the call, Randy or Faith, maybe you know natives that do well in a more acidic soil.
That's a tough situation, Leah, because if you actually go out, in the woods or whatever and look under pine trees, you'll see there's very little growing under pine trees in the woods either. So sometimes there's some mints that will tolerate growing underneath pine trees. Mountain mint is one of the species, and there's several different types of mountain mints. So that would be worth a try, but it's kind of difficult. It's a tough neighborhood. There is a native plant that grows well under pine trees, but you won't want to grow it. It's poison ivy.
Oh, that's highly beneficial, right? It is a high beneficial.
Poison
Yeah,
ivy
yes,
is
it
a
is.
high beneficial. And what about, Randy, what do you think about, and I haven't had enough experience, but what about maybe a native blueberry under the pines?
That's a pretty interesting thought, because obviously blueberry are looking for a very acidic soil, and pine trees are setting that up. But blueberries also like a lot of sun. So, there may be some varieties out there, maybe a low bush variety that may be better suited for that application. That might be worth a try.
Let's see here. Oh, she said it's not very sunny, very rooty and hard soil. We'll have to do a little investigating on that one. We'll try to find something. Until then, let your poison ivy grow.
Hey, Leah, I would mention this, that some plants that might do well under the pine trees would be spring ephemerals. These are obviously plants that just come up in the very early spring. They bloom and they kind of do what they have to do. And by the time summer arrives, they're already disappeared. So there might be some application for some spring ephemerals like bloodroot and things like that.
Let me share my screen here. Can you all see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, so this was Faith's post the other day. It was her birthday and she went out to Ridley Creek State Park and she took a ton of pictures of the early bloomers in the woods, these pretty woodland plants. So I had this just to kind of show, since she already had it all kind of pulled up. So again, we would have to check, I guess, and see how they would do in acidic soil. That I don't know. But here are some options if you have a lot of trees in your area. And you need shade plants. So this is, what is this? Claytonia virginica? I hope I'm
Yeah, it's a spring beauty. And as Randy mentioned, there's like bloodroot as well. There's trilliums, which are incredible. The one thing I would preface, and again, because I live in a place where we don't have any deer, we have lots of traffic and noise and pollution, but we have no real deer. But these things grow very well in my woodland garden, right on the side. Randy from Hawk Mountain would have a little bit more to offer on that. but these ephemerals come out. What's really nice about them is they're coming out. They're the first sign of spring. They're coming up. It's sort of you're awakening up as a person and you're like, oh, winter